This is part 2 of a 3-part series that could change your life. Being autistic means living a life that often doesn't feel like it makes sense. But I can change that. If you're autistic, you need to know this. If you're not autistic, don't you want to know how other folks tick? So, let's start making autism make sense. I'm Quinn, and I'm autistic, and today on Autistic, I want to share with you a powerfully different way of thinking about autism. This is the second of a 3-part introduction to the Autistic Triad of Distinction, a framework that can help you understand and regulate your autistic differences to reduce stress, balance your well-being, and maybe even unlock hidden or suppressed potential. There will be plenty more after this first chapter, but these 3 parts together will give you a good idea of what the triad is, what we can learn from it, and how it can help us trust ourselves and plan ahead with confidence. When I talked about meltdowns and other stress events recently, I introduced the autistic flood. Autistic folks endure a gradually increasing load of overstimulation through the day, and the flood visualises it as an unattended bath with the taps left running. Most days it drains away when the taps are turned off overnight as we sleep, but on some days the flow of stimulation is way too much, too fast, and it overflows, flooding our mental bathroom floors in a stress event like a meltdown or shutdown. The flood is one of many useful analogies to help us paint a relatable picture of why we have meltdowns or shutdowns. But on its own, it doesn't do much to help us manage the stresses behind them. How do we stop that metaphorical bath from flooding the bathroom? The Triad of Distinction can help us do that. In the last part, I explained how the triad came to be and why it might sound familiar. Today, we'll have a chat about how it works, what the 3 leaves of the Triad of Distinction are, and how they map on to established autistic traits we're all familiar with, and how they contribute to the stresses that hurt autistic folks the most. You'll know from last time, you have watched it, haven't you? It's all right if you want to nip off and catch up now. I'll put a chapter marker in the description that'll bring you back here. Welcome back. So, you'll know from last time that this triad of distinction of mine helps to explain and manage the stresses that make our autistic lives more difficult than they should be. Understanding the additional or unique pressures our autistic souls face in the modern world allows us greater insight and control over our own lives than we'd be likely to achieve left to our own devices. Autistic brains process information differently to non-autistic brains. That much we can all agree on. Sometimes we struggle or suffer in situations others treat as trivial, and working out why that is has been one of the goals of autism research from the get-go. Not everyone in the community feels that research has been carried out in the best way, though. They'd argue that far too much time and money has been invested in genetic, environmental and observational studies, with plenty more wasted on disproving crackpot theories and bad science, none of which actually helps us towards happier, safer outcomes or mitigates any of the unnecessary hindrances common to autistic lives. Not long after my teenage diagnosis in the 1980s, it became clear that without appropriate knowledge and training for my teachers, just knowing that I was autistic wasn't going to make my life any easier. All that being diagnosed changed for me was that my parents and teachers just blamed the autism when I confused them instead of each other. Rather than provide a key to better understanding, it just became a convenient rug to sweep all their doubts under. That wasn't enough for me, though. Nobody else may have been interested, but I needed to know what was going on. Every time some behaviour or misunderstanding got brushed off as must be the autism, I set to work mapping out the reasons for it, charting the paths of cause and effect. But every time I tried to discuss my theories with someone to gain some input and draw a consensus, I got shut down. I'd learned why that was many years later, but the frustration only spurred me on to try harder to work things out for myself. For 4 decades, I've been following the science around autism while making my own observations and asking weird questions of thousands of people I meet through my life and work. And not just autistic people. Once I'd narrowed it down to the 3 common denominators we'll talk about today, the mists started to clear. My Triad of Distinction is what helped me to make sense of autism, and it's behind all of the work I've done on this channel for the last 6 or 7 years. Ask the average person in the street to tell you something about autism. They'll say something about emotions. Pretty much guaranteed. Whether it's meltdowns, empathy issues, or the idea that we are emotionless robots, emotional differences, both real and imagined, have been a hallmark of the public perception of autism since the year dot. But whilst many of those commonly held ideas are way off the mark, they're kind of aiming in the right direction. Because from an autistic perspective, emotional differences are important. Enough to make up a whole leaf of the Triad of Distinction. The traditional picture of autism involved a string of emotional deficits, but in the last decade or two, especially since autistic voices have joined the conversation, a different picture has emerged. Dr. Damien Milton's double empathy problem in particular has revolutionised our understanding of just how much small differences in perception and expectation can impact on our communication and our emotional states. Even when we're unaware of mismatched moods ourselves, folks usually aren't shy about pointing out where we differ. Growing up, my folks would frequently tell me I looked like I had dropped a shilling and found sixpence, or that I had a face like a smacked ass, when I was perfectly happy. Like a lot of autists, my neutral expression gets misinterpreted as boredom, inattention, or irritation, which can wind people up the wrong way in seconds. When I'm puzzled or concentrating on something, I apparently look angry or even hostile, and some even say that I have a shifty smile. I couldn't begin to count the emotional misunderstandings, embarrassing scenes, and conflicts caused by my facial expression alone. There's lots of myths about autistic emotions floating about, mostly quite scathing or at least pitying of us. For a while, one of the most prominent names in the academic discussion of autism suggested that autistic people almost completely lacked cognitive empathy, the ability to recognise and assimilate different emotional viewpoints. Whilst the theory was quite quickly and thoroughly consigned to history, it managed a fair amount of damage and still gets quoted as fact now and again in poorly researched articles and AI digests about autism. The double empathy problem I mentioned just now explained how skewed that opinion was. Rather than being a uniform, monolithic structure that you either have or you don't, cognitive empathy is actually totally subjective and built upon not only genes, but the environment, past experiences, and even mood of the observer. Autistic empathy is a similar process to non-autistic empathy, but the things we notice, the brain functions that process them, and the expectations and experiences that shape our conclusions all come from an autistic perspective. That's all there is to it. When our emotions or reactions aren't what someone else's cognitive empathy tells them to expect, we often stress them out. But we'll probably be the only person with mismatched emotions they'll meet all day. Almost everyone we meet has the same effect on us, so no wonder it adds to the autistic flood. That's when we allow you to see us getting it wrong, of course. Some autistic people are very good at disguising or masking our disconnection from the mainstream. How many times have you heard the story? You may even have told it yourself. Of confiding in a friend that you're autistic and getting a disbelieving or even contradictory reply. "You can't be autistic, I'd have noticed." The phrase, Autistic masking does some very heavy lifting these days. It explains a great deal, but it's also misused as an excuse for all sorts of negligence and poor behaviour. Not from autistic folks, I hasten to add. All neurodivergent people who lead independent lives mask in some way. That is, we make efforts to blend in with people by hiding our differences, for survival. The reactions our weird natures provide in some people can range from the unsettling to the intimidating, so masking them is a vital life skill for modern autists. But the picture people seem to have of masking is a bit of a Cliff's Notes version, an incomplete bullet point kind of view. There's a story commonly told about a guy who orders the wrong thing from the restaurant menu, then sits at his table for one, forcing each forkful down his neck and pretending he likes it rather than exposing his mistake to the other diners. It's an entertaining and relatively informative allegory for autistic masking, but it misses about 90% of the point. Unless you live in complete isolation, every human masks to some degree. We do it to avoid embarrassment, to conform to social expectations, and to influence others to like us or follow us. But that kind of social masking is nothing compared to what autistic people have to do to blend in. We're not just swapping round a few biographical details or smiling on cue. Some of us have to pull off a daily performance that Oscar winners would envy. At the heart of any successful disguise is emotional camouflage. Acting excited when everyone else is, looking outraged when expected, and going with the flow, often completely against our natures. It takes a tremendous toll on us, which can be exhausting both mentally and physically. Masking helps shield us from some of the consequences of our mismatched cognitive empathy, but it's not as efficient when it comes to affective empathy, the other side of the empathy coin. Emotions can have an almost infectious quality. You know when someone is laughing and you start to chuckle even though you didn't hear the joke? That's affective empathy. Or when you walk in the room and sense an atmosphere, it's the same thing. It's an unconscious observational skill everyone possesses to some degree, but some autistic folks are very susceptible to picking up on the feelings of others, and very accurately too. Unless you happen to be in very specific professions, that isn't a blessing in the modern world. People hide their feelings all the time for the most innocent of reasons, but nobody likes it when autists like me notice that their true feelings are at odds with what they're telling us verbally. It's all too easy for an autistic question to be misinterpreted as an accusation. More friction, more flood. I'll be making separate videos on each leaf of my triad after this 3-part introduction, but I'll finish this emotion section for today with Alexithymia. At least half of autistic folks, including me, are alexithymic, meaning that if you ask me to tell you how I'm feeling, I can't always do it. It's not that I lack the words, but sometimes I can't pin down my feelings in the heat of the moment. I can't pick one emotion or mood out of the whirlwind of mixed feelings I'm experiencing. If things get too emotionally charged, my emotions can evaporate, leaving me almost numb, in a calm and practical frame of mind, a kind of emotional sidestep, if you like. Ideal in a crisis, when I'm the one with a cool head whilst all around are losing theirs, but not so good when everyone's expecting whoops of joy or tears of anguish. It's not that my emotions are completely turned off either. They're just dampened and delayed. There can still be physiological reactions like goosebumps, sweating, or a change in heart rate, but little or nothing emotional enters my mind. After the event, usually hours, but sometimes days or even years later, the memories and emotions can pop back in like they were fresh, and that can lead to difficult exchanges when it happens publicly. The Triad of Distinction allows us to categorise and quantify all autistic stress, not just emotional distress. But since it's the first thing that comes to most people's minds, it's the first thing on the triad. Most of the autistic behaviours we hear talked about the most are those tied to emotional reactions, and not just the more notable ones like meltdowns. Understanding our emotional makeup better, learning our triggers, so to speak, gives us a better chance of taking control of such things. All the three leaves of the triad interact with each other, but emotions perhaps the most, because all stress carries an emotional component with it. And autistic stress is one that stems directly from our differences. They're burdens we would be very unlikely to carry if we weren't autistic, and all of them are loaded with an emotional charge. It might be confusion, shame, exclusion, sadness, anger, or indignation perhaps. And how intense those emotions feel gives us a measure of the depth of each individual disparity and what priority we should assign to it. If emotional stressors aren't the main cause of your frustrations at being autistic in a neurotypical world, then maybe it's sensory stress, the second leaf on the triad clover. Back when I was diagnosed in the 1980s, nobody seemed to have a clue about the sensory differences autistic people experience. There was a little talk about synesthesia in rare isolated cases, but otherwise nothing much about our senses at all. Well, that's not strictly true. They were talked about, but in less constructive terms. My childhood sensory differences earned me labels like fussy eater, nosy Parker, and contrary Mary, along with punishments for defiance, willful ignorance, crying wolf, and not paying attention. Oh, and a few unnecessary medical examinations. Autistic sensory differences have always been noticed, but until recently few people saw them for what they really are. My ears have never been any more sensitive than anyone else's, yet I sometimes overhear things people don't want me to, which has got me into trouble all my life. It's not that my hearing is any more acute, but my brain seems to discriminate sounds differently to other people in the room. Almost like I've got an alternative set of filters built in that let through different tones. That's when I'm on top form, peak efficiency, firing on all cylinders. When I'm not 100%, and let's be honest, that's a lot of the time for most of us these days, those same anomalies in auditory processing can make a crowded room a spaghettified mess of human noise my brain can't unravel. Those days I get bombarded with information faster than I can digest it, and I get overwhelmed quickly. Whether I get into trouble for overhearing things, told off for not listening, or just left out because my attention was distracted by a different sound or conversation, my auditory processing was the source of a lot of autistic stresses that tested my flood levels over the years. Hearing is just one of the traditional cardinal senses, but similar nuances in sensory processing can apply to any of our senses, and not just the five we hear about in school: sight, sound, touch, taste, and smell. There's a range of differences reported by autistic folks across all the senses, and they're often accentuated or aggravated by mood and environment. They vary from person to person and don't affect any two of us in quite the same way, but they can have a huge impact on our lives and our decision making. What and where we eat, what we do for a living, who we work for, what we wear, how we spend our free time, and even the company we keep are all potentially sensory decisions. By the way, if you're new to the channel, you won't know that Autistic is my bread and butter. My writing and this channel are my only source of income, so every like and share really makes a difference. If you can afford to help support me doing my work and feel in a generous mood, then please hop over to Patreon and make a monthly donation. Or leave a one-off thanks here on YouTube, or buy me a coffee on Ko-fi. Links are all in the description. Thank you. Interoception is on this sensory leaf too. The internal senses that tell us about our bodies, our health, well-being, and the relative positions of our body parts. Interoceptive stresses can actually be harder to mitigate against than stresses to our perception. Feeling too hot and wanting to strip off whilst everyone else is wrapping up and turning the heating on barely scratches the surface. Interoceptive differences can be antisocial, they can be embarrassing, and they can be hazardous to our health. When doctors don't understand what we're trying to tell them or make the wrong conclusions from our autistic sensory feedback, the consequences can be life-changing, even life-ending. I've been burned by this one myself. I suffered years of needless pain and discomfort because it took me so long and so many attempts to get a doctor to make the right connections with me. When we judge the role of sensory differences in our personal triad profiles, our emotional responses to them are very important, because much of the distress caused by our sensory differences comes as shame, humiliation, or self-loathing. Sensory stimuli are subjective, so it's difficult to get a bead on the distance between our perceptions and those of others. It's like that old question of whether the colour I see as blue in my mind is the same as the blue that you see in yours, or the blue that my blind friends see in their imaginations. Sometimes the best guide we have to go on is how stressful the consequences of sensory mismatches or overwhelms are. If it's not the sensory distress itself that's flooding us, then it's the distress caused by the reactions or questions of others about it. So, that's 2 leaves on the triad clover so far: emotional stress and sensory. I mentioned in the last video, you did watch it, didn't you? I mentioned in the last video that the final category was the most difficult one to name, because I had to pick exactly the right word for it. It's not difficult to explain it to neurodivergent folks, not just autistic, but neurodivergent in general, because they seem to get it right away. But neurotypical people don't seem to click with it quite as readily. Some have even taken it the wrong way if I've not chosen my words very cautiously and carefully. Quite a few choices went in the bin before I settled on veracity. The word veracity comes from the Latin verus, or truth. To verify something, to fact-check it, to prove its validity comes from the same Latin root. The more evidence there is to support a statement, the more you can rely on its truth or its veracity. A theory that survived 1,001 experiments without being disproved is more veracious than an untested idea, and the veracity of a lie is 0. The highbrow way of describing autistic veracity is that most of us have a heightened awareness of and a powerful need for informational and structural fidelity. The average Joe version: we get tetchy when our truth gets questioned. Veracity is in play whenever something contradicts, blocks, or messes with the proper functioning of things as we see it. Lots of the more stereotypical traits of autism are subject to or are the results of the autistic need for or sensitivity to veracity. So, yes, our sense of veracity is being taxed a lot when we know or suspect that someone is lying to us, and it's only going to get worse if they dig their heels in. Unfortunately, an autism diagnosis, or even a reputation for being a bit weird, can see us being spoken over or socially outnumbered into accepting a falsehood over our objections, and that really opens the floodgates. But our veracity is also questioned when our routines are interrupted or changed without our consent. When Mum gave me the wrong brand of fish fingers when I was 6, my tears weren't just for the sensory discomfort of them tasting and feeling wrong, it was a disruption to my sense of truth and continuity, my routine. Veracity plays a big part in PDA for a lot of us, so-called pathological demand avoidance. Those of us who fit the PDA profile feel a particular frustration, confusion, disappointment, or affront when demands are made of us, which falls squarely into the veracity bin. Our veracity is being tickled every time we see hypocrisy or bending of the truth. It's what makes some of us feel oppositional towards certain kinds of advertising that make unlikely claims or that foster unrealistic expectations. It even influences what we choose to read or even watch on YouTube. If you're autistic and you're still watching this, then you most probably sense my sincerity, or your autistically acute sense of veracity would be on fire by now. If you're the kind of autist that stacks your books alphabetical and your coloured towels piled up to match the colours of the rainbow, then anyone who messes it up is assaulting your sense of veracity. And if you're an autist who has invested years of your time into a carefully curated, personally encrypted, instant access filing system that to everyone else looks like a bloody mess, your veracity will burn like the fires of Hades when that first guy does you a favour by tidying it up. Everyone on the planet has an internal sense of how things are that goes way beyond just what's right and wrong. It goes from the philosophical questions of consciousness and purpose right down to the fundamentals of the physical world. When someone does something counterintuitive or tells an obvious intentional lie, it's as crazy an assault on our well-being as if we'd just seen an apple falling upwards into a polka-dot sky. And it sets the floodwaters flowing. So, that completes our brief introduction to the 3 leaves of the Triad of Distinction. The doctors and theorists can line up list after list of new symptoms and traits of autism, new ways of interpreting us from novel observations in behavioural patterns to paradigm-shifting theories, but they rarely seem to have much, if any, relevance to my life. While they've been doing that, I worked out the Triad of Distinction on me Todd, and it's made a genuine difference to me, allowing me to make sense of autism for my own needs, to live my life. If we're to be happy with ourselves, we need to make sense not only of what makes us stand out from the crowd, but how to reconcile that with the need to be part of that crowd. It's a difficult balance that many of us aren't equipped for at all, but most of us would appreciate some help with. I can't directly help all the people I'd like to, but by sharing the Triad of Distinction, I hope I'll give at least some of you a head start in helping yourselves. Understanding what makes me vulnerable allows me to make better choices, to plan ahead more confidently, and to better protect myself and the people around me. But more than that, having that knowledge, that assurance, is what truly allows me, despite all the extra obstacles and baggage that comes with an autistic life, to be both happy when times are good and optimistic when they're not. Next time, I'll finish this first chapter with a memorable tale from my distant past and a practical demonstration to show you how you can start using the Triad framework as a tool to map out your own personal Triad of Distinction. I'm Quinn, and I'm autistic. Thanks for watching, and see you in part 3 of How I Made Autism Make Sense.